Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar this afternoon. We really have a lot of content for you, and I'm delighted, as you'll see, that we're going to be joined by Professor Kosh Ray and Professor Ahmed Fuad, who, in my view, are two of the world experts on exactly this topic. So we're going to be able to pick their brains and get absolutely the best up-to-date evidence. Now, before we start, it's worthwhile saying that this webinar supports the National AHSN AAC Lipids Management and Familial Hypercholesterolemia Program. You'll see that in the chat. It's brought to you in a partnership between the Accelerated Access Collaborative, the AHSN Network, and Novartis Pharmaceuticals. And I think one of the key things is that this will be available on the Heart UK pages in the Cholesterol Together education program. So if you want to see it again, absolutely, it will be available. So before we start, this is all about cholesterol, and we want to know how much you know already. And this is for fun, but we're going to poll you. Here is the first poll. I'm publishing that now. Hopefully, we'll be able to see it. In England, in a population of nearly 250,000 patients with atherosclerosis in around 400 GP practices, how many cardiovascular deaths, non-fatal MIs, and strokes occur over an average of about 5.25 years. So you can see the four potential answers, 45,000, 30,000, nearly 20,000, or 13,000. Be great if you haven't voted, if you could vote now. And perhaps one of the team can tell me, we've got nearly 110 people on the seminar today, when the voting is looking like it's stable. Still voting going on. Okay, so we're pretty much stable now. Let's end the poll and look at the results. Perhaps you can show me the results, team, in a second.
%52% for 45,000.
Yep, fantastic, isn't it? So we'll tell you what the results are towards the end, but you're not far wrong. And I think that's really, really important. Let's see what other polls we have. We start the second poll. In your clinical practice, what proportion of your patients with coronary artery disease, with stroke, or an LDL, and you're going to have to remember this figure, an LDL of below 1.4 or non-HDL below 2.2. Vote now, please. And that seems fairly consistent. The answer there, I'm going to end the poll there, guys, is the vast majority of people are not getting their patients down to below 1.4, which is the current European target, as you will see as we go through the seminar. I can see as the polling's going that some of you are achieving that figure. Well done. Okay, so we end that poll and we go to the third and last poll before we go on with the seminar team. That would be great. Let's end that poll. And bring up the third poll, please. So what is the relative risk reduction in cardiovascular death, non-fatal MI or stroke per millimolar per liter lowering of LDL cholesterol over 5 years? And again, if you could vote, that would be great. Super, and I think we are there. So again, Jen and the team, if we could end that poll, most people seem to think it's around 22%. And again, we'll give you the figures as we go on. Okay, so at this point, let's go to my introductory slides. Let me see if I can find these and publish those. So let's start those. So welcome everybody again. My name is Derek Connolly. I'm a cardiologist in Birmingham, where I'm also director of R&D, and I'm on the council, as is Ahmed, of the Primary Care Cardiovascular Society. And you all know that cardiovascular disease is incredibly important. It's important because it kills younger people. And if you look in terms of years of life lost, it's by far the world's biggest killer. And if you look at what we spend on it, it's about £9 billion per year. Now, the NHS executive are aware of this, and they know that many of the therapies that we suggest not only reduce mortality, reduce strokes, reduce heart attacks, but they are massively cost effective. And of course, that's why the NHS long-term plan names cardiovascular disease as the single biggest area where the NHS can save lives and money over the next 10 years. And why is that? Well, it's because we've done lots of science over the last 30 years. And much in the same way as the blood pressure targets have come down, we've brought with new therapies the LDL cholesterol targets down. This is the European Society guidance as of 2019. And you can see that we have this term of very high risk where we want the LDL below 1.4. And that's anyone with atherosclerosis. They don't have to have had an event, but if they have an event, this very much includes them as well. Anyone with an atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease score greater than 10%, such as QRIS 2 or 3, anyone with familial hyperlipidemia or CKD 4 and 5, anyone with diabetes and end organ damage or type 1 diabetes for 20 years or more. As you can see, we now want an LDL of below 1.4. Now, how do you do that? Well, in the same way with blood pressure, if you've got someone with a systolic blood pressure of 180, you start them on amlodipine, but you're pretty certain you're going to have to add in other therapies to reach that target. And it's exactly the same now with lipid lowering. In the old days, we only had statins. Now we have 5 different ways, all NICE recommended, for lowering cholesterol. And the truth is that you're going to have to use them in combination. Now, in 2019, we had 3. So you'd start a statin, then you start ezetimibe, then you start a monoclonal antibody for against PCSK9 if the patient was eligible. And that was the standard. But of course, in the last 18 months, we've seen massive progress with the recommendation of 2 completely new therapies in LDL cholesterol reduction, both of which are NICE recommended. And we'll be talking about them in a second. But why are we doing that? Well, there is a plethora of evidence, incontrovertible evidence, both in primary and in secondary prevention, that lowering LDL cholesterol works. By the way, this is an American unit. 100 is 2.6. That's why we use 2.6 in UK money. But it is, you can see there that the lower you take your LDL, the less likely you are to have a cardiovascular event. And people get hung up about the difference between LDL and non-HDL. The biggest component of non-HDL is LDL. So here is the graph for men and women for non-HDL against cardiovascular disease risk. And you can see it's exactly the same line. The lower you take your LDL cholesterol, the lower you take your non-HDL cholesterol. And for the period you take it low, the less likely it is that you'll have a cardiovascular event. And that period is really important because, of course, randomized controlled trials are only 2 to 4 years. Cohort studies, 12 years. Now, and Britain leads the way with this, we have the human gene program. And you can see here that we have Mendelian randomization, nearly 400,000 patients in it, 52 years on average of follow-up. And you can see that there is a direct relationship between LDL and cardiovascular event. So it's a bit like smoking in pack years. Clearly, if you smoke for many years, you're more likely to have events. Exactly the same. LDL cholesterol tracks in adulthood, and the longer you're exposed to that high LDL, the more likely you are to have a cardiovascular event. Now, what that means is we can now go back and Professor Rain and Professor Friends and others have done this, looking at all of the trials we've done in LDL cholesterol reduction by whatever means we lower LDL. And pretty much the results we would expect are related to the LDL reduction and the time it's been reduced. And you can go and read that paper. It's very persuasive for the idea that it's all about the LDL. So how good are we at treating it? Well, if we put the benchmark really high and we put an LDL of 2.6, which is the old benchmark, then we get 70% of patients. If we put it down to 1.8, which was the intermediate old benchmark, we get about a third of patients just using high potency statins. But of course, we know that when we bring it down to 1.4, we're not going to achieve in the vast majority of patients that with a high potency statin alone. So how should we do it? Well, we should do it with combination therapies. Again, Professor Ray was the main investigator in this trial. This is Da Vinci. There's going to be an update called Santorini coming in the autumn. And ostensibly, as you can see, the only way you're going to attain the LDL targets for 2019 in the hash is by adding therapies in. And that analogy in primary care for what we do in hypertension is perfect, because here you can see that it's only with combinations, perhaps including things to inhibit PCSK9, that we're getting a majority of the patients down to the ideal target. So this is the 2019 European guidance. It's very similar in North America, and it's going to be changing very soon. But of course, in the UK, the NICE guidance was 2013. It's going to be updated. And don't be surprised if it looks like the European, if it looks like the North American guidance. So what we're telling you now is likely to be the future of UK lipidology. So what else is the future? Well, one thing that's maybe here already is if someone has a heart attack, because I know that I'm not going to attain an LDL cholesterol of 1.4 in patients, and I know that too low a cholesterol isn't really a problem. We know from that from a variety of studies. I put everybody on a statin and ezetimibe, and then I usually measure the LDL at their first visit to clinic, which is at 6 weeks. And if they're not getting to target and they make the NICE criteria for instance, INCUSIRAN, you're about to hear about that, then I'll put them on that as well. And you can see in the future, we might be putting them on PCSK9 inhibition at the beginning, and that is the potential possibility going forward. Okay, so lipid lowering has evolved. Yes, we've had high potency statins now for 30 years, but we've got ezetimibe and plenty of data that works, and it's cheap, £20 per year. So we should be, in the majority of patients, using that. We now have bempedoic acid for people that can't tolerate statins. We have still got the PCSK monoclonal antibodies, but the NICE entry criteria for that is a minimum of an LDL of 3.5. But we're about to hear about INCUSIRAN. But also, just be aware, we're not standing still. There are more things in blue there that are coming that we'll be talking about in future webinars, I'm sure. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to hand over to Kosh. Kosh, you should know Kosh is professor at Imperial in London, but he's a Midlands boy. And in my humble opinion, and Kosh is my friend, he is #1 in the world in lipidology. Kosh.
Thanks, Derek. So I'm going to just start my slides. So I'm going to add to the clinical need that Derek's very nicely covered and talk a little bit about what inclisiran is and what you need to know about it and why it came about. So the main things I want to cover is, do we need anything other than statins? How do PCSK9 lowering therapies work? We've got 2 available in the UK. What might be achievable, and what do you measure when you're using these therapies? So we talk a lot. Let me walk you through this. So this is a recent paper that we've published from the Da Vinci Registry. And it was important for a number of reasons. Targets and goals mean absolutely nothing unless you think about cardiovascular risk. So let me show you 2 examples here. So we've got 2,000 people with established cardiovascular risk, with established cardiovascular disease rather. So they've had an MI, PAD, or they've had a stroke, and that's the proportion shown on the right. Now, we would basically turn around and say, by the old European guidelines, we should be aiming to get people below 1.8. And we know basically that a large chunk of the population, 61%, using statin-based monotherapy wouldn't. So we can estimate, just as you do CURIS-2, CURIS-3, and so forth, we can do that for secondary prevention, and we can estimate residual risk. So what was their event rate over 10 years? And that was 32%. What we've done is, because we know, and Derek showed you nicely, the cholesterol treatment trial is, we can simulate bringing everybody down. So their starting LDL was 2.44. What would I get if I changed that whole population and brought everybody's LDL down to 1.79? Well, what I'd get is risk reduction of 4% in absolute terms. The event rate would now fall to 28%. And if I brought people down below 1.4, those newer goals that that Derek talked about, so let's say everybody gets to 1.39, the 10-year event rate comes down from 32% to 25%. So that's an absolute change, an absolute risk lowering of 6%. And if you do the same again and bring people down below 1 millimole, that's going to come down even further. So looking at events Looking at goals or LDL on its own means absolutely nothing unless you look at risk. At the top on the right hand side, you can see a group of people who allegedly were below one, well, not allegedly, they were below 1.8, but they had a lot of comorbidities. So even though their LDL was down at around about 1.42, for example, their 10-year event rate, because there was a lot of people with CKD, with diabetes, low HDL smokers, the 10-year risk was still 35%. So you've got to look at both of these together in some form of context. So we can see, we talk a lot about population health, and a lot of you have heard about this population health approach. Let me give an example of what that means. So here is another registry coming out of Sweden, real world data, a bit like our CPRD data. So this is the LDL distribution when you come in with an MI. You'll see that there are a lot of people already actually with LDLs below 1.4, but they've had a recurrent event, or they've had a prior disease, they're probably on a statin, but they still go on and have another event. So thinking about LDL as a normal or abnormal doesn't make sense. It's about, is it appropriate for your level of genetic vulnerability? And what we do is we give everybody a statin. So the group on the right-hand side shift to the left. So you'll see that vertical line, 1.4, and that's the goal. By giving everybody a statin, we move people, we remove some of these outliers. And you've always got the question of, well, maybe I haven't optimized the statin because, you know, Mrs. Smith was 82 and I only gave her 10 milligrams of atorvastatin. Well, we can simulate what would happen to the distribution because, you know, when you double the dose of statin, you get a further 6% lowering. But the biggest return that you get is when you start using those first doses. And when you double the dose, you only get 6% further lowering. So that population distribution on the top right doesn't look that different from the bottom left there. So when you really start to shift those outliers from the right of that line to the left is when you add in a second or a third drug. And this is the addition of ezetimibe, and that is the addition of a PCSK9 inhibitor. So you're not talking about using these therapies in general for absolutely every single individual. You're talking about those additional people that would remain at high residual risk, bringing them over to the left-hand side, and thus improving the health of the population, because as you've seen, that tracks with outcomes. So what are these PCSK9 inhibitors? Well, to do that, I've taken a schematic of the paper of ours looking at the role of statins and PCSK9 lowering therapies. When you give somebody a statin, you reduce the production of cholesterol in the liver. So the way that your body responds is it makes more LDL receptors. Now, these are like suction cups, and that's what lowers blood cholesterol levels. The more of these suction cups you have, the better off you are, because it's getting bigger reductions in LDL. Now, the problem is there's a second protein, and that may be why you get a ceiling when you get to the top dose of statins. So there's a second protein called PCSK9, and what that's doing is killing off the LDL receptors. Even though you're making more of these, some of these are now dying. So when you diet, when you take ezetimibe, statin, or fibrate, all of these produce more PCSK9. So it makes sense that if you either stop the binding, the ability of PCSK9 to bind to the LDL receptor, then you're going to keep these suction cups alive longer, and therefore that combination will give you bigger reductions. So the approach that we've had before are with the monoclonals, and this is a bit like having a bucket and collecting everything in blood. But the problem is the main source of PCSK9, the tap, if you will, is the liver, and 80% of what's in blood comes from the liver. You can either use a bucket, not so efficient, or you can switch the tap off. And that's what these RNA-based therapies do. So on the left-hand side, this is me, let's say, giving 3 different doses of a monoclonal, a PCSK9 inhibitor, in this case, evolocumab. On the left-hand side, you see the amount of free PCSK9 if I was to measure it in blood. And on the right-hand side, you can see the effect on LDL lowering. So the reason we're having to dose every 2 weeks is that if I didn't dose every 2 weeks, I wouldn't get that smooth peak and trough. So if you dose the same drug, let's say a month apart or 2 months apart, you're going to get much bigger peak and troughs. And that's important, because now what nature has given us, and this was awarded the Nobel Prize, is what's called the so-called gene silencing, but nature has a way of switching off proteins. Everything that appears, every protein essentially has a code, and that is your gene, and that's in your DNA. But you can't make the protein without a message. And that's the step that we are stopping or breaking down. So you can do this in one of two ways. You can either use a single strand of drug, antisense, working inside the nucleus on the left-hand side. The disadvantage of this approach is that you're going to have to dose every month, but we are looking at that for something called Lp(a). On the right-hand side are the siRNA-based approaches, and that's really probably more convenient because you can probably dose twice a year or only a couple of, 3 times a year, let's say. And the reason is you've got a bit of machinery in the cytoplasm called the RISC complex using double-stranded RNA, and the body's already using natural sequences, so we're just telling it what to go after. In this case, that's PCSK9 message. So the 2 strands separate, it's retained in the RISC complex, and when in the cytoplasm, mRNA, messenger RNA for PCSK9 appears, it's cut. And that's what gives it a long duration of action. So you're used to thinking about agonists and antagonists and blocking receptors. And that's dependent on how much drug you've got available. The beauty of this is already there, and it's highly efficient, and it's breaking down multiple transcripts. So that's what gives it a long duration of action, not interfering with any of the small molecules you're popping on a regular basis. The second really cool thing about it was discovered by the University of Leiden. And that is, okay, if I've got this drug, how do I get it into the liver? Well, again, nature's given us a way. So your hepatocytes, your liver cells, express something called the acyl-glycoprotein receptor. It's got a natural function. The function is you've got aging senescent cells, and it binds to those cells and removes them from the circulation. So if we know that on the surface of these aging cells, there's a certain molecule that's expressed, that's recognized, we could create that artificially. And that's a sugar residue called GalNAc. If I tag GalNAc onto essentially any drug, I can get it into the liver. And the advantage of that is I don't need so much drug. So things like local injection site reactions, all of these type of things are reduced. And this is how every drug being developed to target RNA-based therapies is actually being developed. And that's been a huge advantage. So 2 important steps. So when we first tested inclisiran and the dose that's available, you basically, with these dose ranging studies, you pick the dose, the sweet spots like Goldilocks and the 3 bears, not too hot, not too cold, just right. And 300 milligrams was chosen because it was better than 200 and it was no different from 500. So you don't want to go to too high doses if you can help it. And 300 was perfect. But what I want you to look at is this. So after a single injection, within 15 days, you've already got 42% lowering. Your peak effect is roughly at about day 30 to day 45. And you see the steady return back towards baseline at about 2 to 4% a month. So a better way of thinking about this is not on an individual day, but the area under the curve. So a single injection over 9 months is giving you 41% lowering of LDL. But we're greedy, we want to do better. So what we did was we gave a second dose on day 90. And what you got with that was a little bit more in the way of a peak reduction, so about 55% lowering a couple of months after the second injection, but you got a longer durable effect. So that meant after that second injection, you got this window of 6 months where you were maintaining 50% lowering of LDL. So that's the reason for the injection on day 90. If you didn't, you still got good lowering, but you've got steady decline. So that means that after that second injection, you can go to 6 monthly dosing. So in the second year, although in the first you've got 3 injections, from year 2 onwards is twice a year. And we tested that formally in 3 trials, totaling 3,600 people called ORION 9, 10, and 11. And what we basically did was we tested people with heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. We tested people with established cardiovascular disease. We tested people with established cardiovascular disease or high-risk primary prevention. These people were already on statins. Many were on ezetimibe, but their LDLs were still very high. So you would say there's an unmet need, and either we leave them as they are or we bring their cholesterol levels down. And that's the rationale, and that's how drug development works. The FDA, EMA, MHRA approvals. And what we're able to show is on the left-hand side, this is the percentage and absolute lowering of PCSK9 in ORION 10 and 11. So even with that 6-monthly dosing schedule, you can shut down the hepatic tap. You can't get more than 80% lowering because there's only 80% coming from the liver, and that's the only thing you're targeting. But what that translates into, and ORION 10 is shown at the top, ORION 11 at the bottom, is you get really quite nice, smooth peak and troughs. And that basically means that we have a treatment which, when you know a patient has shown up and you've watched it go in with your eyes, you're not reliant on the patient flushing it down the toilet or not taking it, basically. So you know it's in and you know it works and you know it's, as I'll show you, that it's safe. So these are what we call adverse events. I've developed many drugs over the years. And when you look at small molecules, you don't see something as flat as this, so equally balanced between placebo and active injections. And the beauty of it is because it's highly specific. It's only targeting one specific message. And remember your basic biology, Watson-Crick hybridization, your DNA double helix. You basically get matching strands, complementary, binding to each other and wrapping itself around. And that's what you're doing by targeting the message for that short sequence. You don't see anything with abnormal LFTs or any adverse events. It's not an outcomes trial. The trend is already in the right direction towards lower events. But this is only 18 months, and this is only 3,600 patients. The larger outcome trials are ongoing. The only thing you get is a mild to moderate excess of injection site, what we call adverse events. This might be somebody said, oh, it stung when you put the needle in, or, oh, there was a bit of itching. These are mild, these are transient, they go away, they often don't recur on repeat injection. Liver function, absolutely flat as a pancake. Kidney function, flat as a pancake. CK, hematological parameters, flat as a pancake. There's nothing for you to monitor other than look at the LDL 30 to 45 days later. Heterozygous FH. So here's a population where the majority of people inherited a bad gene from mum or dad, essentially meaning they don't have enough LDL receptors or these are dysfunctional. If you find them, and we're bad at finding these people anyway, but once you find them, if you give them a statin, you can ramp up production of the LDL receptor with the statins and ezetimibe, but your levels are still going to be really quite high, your LDL, because you're working on half your LDL receptor capacity. Now imagine I shut down PCSK9, as shown at the bottom from the liver, and I keep those LDL receptors alive. Well, actually, by ramping up production and keeping them alive through that one good gene, I'm getting people now down to goals, i.e. below about 1.8, particularly if I find them. So in terms of combination therapy, statins alone for people, as we've already shown you, about 4 out of 5 people need a second or a third agent. So we've now got another tool. And the way that the NICE criteria have kind of looked at this is to look at people with ASCVD with an LDL above 2.6, and the addition of inclisiran will basically bring them down to about 1.3. If you do the maths from CTT, that's about a 30% relative risk reduction. We've had a lot of problems with COVID, patients not showing up, coming off meds. If you take a small molecule and a patient doesn't get a refill, the drug effect is worn off. These vertical bars here, this is inclisiran 300 milligrams, and this is 2 doses of inclisiran, no third dose, just 2 doses. The vertical bars are how many days each individual patient still has more than 20% lowering of LDL. So 20% lowering of LDL is about 40 milligrams of pravastatin. If your patient took pravastatin today and no other dose, would they still be responding in 364 days? The answer is no. So here now with 2 doses on board, even without a third dose, 84% of patients are still getting an additional 20% lowering from baseline. We've got a real problem with patients not taking medications properly with small molecules. And I want to show you something. There's nothing magical about the LDL lowering on the y-axis that your patient's going to achieve. UK data. What they will achieve depends upon what we as the doctors prescribe and what the patient does with that. So if the patients don't take the drugs, they're all on the left-hand side, there's no reduction. But if the patient is willing to do it and we don't prescribe the right intensity, they're in the middle. But it's only when we and the patients work together properly, you get the maximum reduction in LDL. And that tracks with outcomes. So there's nothing magical about outcomes. Part of that is related to LDL lowering, which depends upon what we, the physicians, prescribe, what they, the patients, do with that prescription, whether they take it or not. And so something that goes in and that can be injected provides us with a way of thinking about healthcare systems. And we don't think about, with non-communicable diseases, about long-term exposure. You think about this with the environment, for example, about pollution, and you will know about particle sizes and so forth. On the left-hand side are 60 individual patients. Between two, they're all allegedly on a stable dose of a statin. But between day 1 and day 180, some people's LDLs have gone up by 50%, others have gone down. That's adherence or non-adherence or variable adherence. That is not biological variability. And we know from statin trials, the greater your variability over 5 years, the worse your risk. So when they show up to clinic, maybe they're taking the prescription properly before they show up, and you think, yeah, the number's good. How do you know what's happening the rest of the time? But the data would suggest that part of the reason we've got this burden of cardiovascular disease, that patients are not adherent, and it's difficult for them to do that. So here we have a system whereby, for example, when we add a drug like inclisiran in, everybody's getting additional benefit. This is individual additional reduction. You might look at that and say, oh, actually, but there's variability. It's not. They're all on statins. So this behavior on the left-hand side is also happening in the background. So if your patient comes in to show up to have the injection, we need to reinforce the blood pressure tablets, stop smoking, the weight, and are you taking your statin? So this treatment, as part of a healthcare delivery and a health systems delivery, provides us with innovation that we wouldn't have. We know that at the moment, the way that tools are working is that basically people are sending you information, how to find patients, and then treat them if they're above a certain level. What we might have in the future, and this is some work that we've done, where you could look at your entire region and GP practice, the heights of the number of individual people in different 10-year risk categories and different levels of non-HDL. And this is in the middle on a log scale. And on the right-hand side is a heat map. Let's say, from a cost-effectiveness perspective, and from a cost-effectiveness perspective, what we could do is identify a level of risk, because you've now got something equivalent to Q risk, but for secondary prevention, and you choose a certain level of LDL. What you can basically then do is shift your higher risk patients to a lower risk group. Let me show you what population health could look like. So this is basically taking a general population. There's a distribution of risk. So where do I start off? 20%. This is in a population of 250,000 people. 273,000 would be a 10-year risk of less than 20%. 179,000 bottom row are in the 20 to 40% category, and so forth. So very few people are in the really high risk category, but you've got a whole range. Now, let's say this entire population with that risk distribution has an LDL above 2.6. If we lower their LDL by 50%, so 1.3 millimoles, what you're going to see is instead of 2,500 people in the 80 to 100% category, that number drops to 222. You now have, instead of 7,600 people in that 60 to 80% category, 1,400. Instead of 37,000 people now in the 40 to 60% category, you now have 12,000 only. And instead of 179,000 people in the 20 to 40% category, you've got 112. What you've done is you've pushed more people into the lowest risk category. You've gone up, which is what you want to do, from 273 to 373,000. So that's population health 101 as we, or me, are looking at in UK general population. So we've got a problem. Combination therapy, combination therapy, combination therapy. This was a European registry looking at the use of evolocumab in Europe. Great drug. Who are we giving it to currently? We're giving it to people who are the outliers, because essentially there's a reimbursement threshold of 3.5 or 4 millimoles, as Derek said. But when you use it, you get exactly what the trials show. But if you use it as monotherapy, which is shown on the right-hand side, you're only going to get a tiny proportion of people that will get to goal. these drugs work better when they're used on a background of statin therapy, because you're going to need combo therapy to get people to goal. So this is where the bulk of our population sit. And we're really fortunate that with that 2.6 NICE threshold for ASCVD patients, a lot of these patients that wouldn't get any other treatment are now able to get LDLs down to about 1.3 and therefore have a lower risk reduction or a greater risk reduction. So clearly there are challenges. We're incredibly lucky to have all of these treatments. So some part of this is rethinking healthcare delivery, and there are digital tools and other things that Ahmet's going to talk about, and that is exactly how we're going to implement population health. Thank you.
That was super, Kosh. Absolutely fantastic. And a great review of all of the science by which we now have the tools to lower LDL cholesterol, which we didn't have before. It is a fantastic thing that we are developing. And I know that we've already had some questions asked. I'd be grateful if you continue to ask questions in the chat, and we will come to the questions once we've gone through the next super talk. And I'm going to introduce Professor Ahmed Fouad. I think you'll all know him, probably the most famous cardiovascular GP in the UK, and a very great friend of mine. Also very much a leading force in the Primary Care Cardiovascular Society. Ahmed, over to you. You're going to tell us how we're going to do it.
Apologies, Ahmet. I remotely muted you, so you will need to put your microphone back on. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Derek, and the lovely introduction. Fabulous talks from you guys. You know, you guys in your ivory towers are telling us about the science. I'm now going to try and talk to the people on the ground who are going to do this work and hopefully use what you guys have really pushed the boundaries of science with, especially Kosh. I think your work has been incredible. So I'm going to talk about how we're going to achieve this. These are my conflicts of interest. I've advised and lectured for every single company who's made cardiovascular drugs. I think Derek showed this in a different way earlier. I mean, cardiovascular disease is still responsible for a huge number of premature deaths in the UK. It's the biggest driver of health inequalities. And sadly, we've seen over the last 12 years that those health inequalities have widened between the poorest, the richest, the South and the North. And we're still seeing a lot of deaths. Someone dies every 3 minutes from cardiovascular disease. And that's costing us a hell of a lot of money in terms of direct costs and indirect costs. And we've got almost 8 million people living with cardiovascular disease. One thing I'm often faced with still, which saddens me in the NHS and often in primary care, but also in secondary care, is that we still are a bit skeptical about very low LDL levels. And we know it's irrefutable evidence that the higher your LDL, the greater the risk of major cardiovascular events, even if you adjust that with hazard ratios. And this cumulative arterial burden of LDL drives the development and progression of atherosclerotic disease. So patients who achieve very low LDLs have a lower risk of major cardiovascular events. And I think we should be pushing those lower and lower, as Derek and Kosh have shown you. And we need more than just statins to do that. So Public Health England, NHS England came up with some ambitions, and the ABC, atrial fibrillation, blood pressure, and cholesterol. And I firmly believe that cholesterol is the area that we do worst at. It is still the Cinderella, in my opinion, of cardiovascular disease, along with actually peripheral arterial disease, that we don't tackle nearly as well as we should. So the ambitions are to detect more high cholesterol, 75% by 2029, manage it more aggressively, and 45% I think is a very conservative target, But the area we do really badly at is detecting those heterozygous FH that Kosh talked about. We're only detecting about 8%, and we need to do far better. One of the ways that we're trying to do this in primary care is with our NHS Health Check programs, where we're inviting 40 to 74-year-olds into our practices, taking a history, doing all these measurements, including checking cholesterol, having services we can refer them to, whether it be weight management, exercise on prescription alcohol, brief advice. But if we concentrate on cholesterol, trying to get patients onto statins early and at Q-risk scores of 10% or over. And we know that we should have around 265,000 people in the UK with FH. We're only detecting around 8%. And of the estimated 60,000 or so children in the UK, fewer than 600 of those are detected. And probably for another talk, but my practice is one of the practices undertaking the child adult screening program, where we're doing heel prick tests on 12-month-olds as they come into the practice for their vaccinations, and doing genetic testing if required. So this is a HeFH study which looked at patients with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease who use moderate or high-intensity statins. And you can see that it's actually quite shocking that, you know, we're only not achieving LDL cholesterol targets of less than 1.8 millimoles in a huge number of these patients. So we need to be doing far better in achieving these targets. And I think that's one of the barriers we have, that we don't have target setting in secondary prevention, let alone primary prevention, in many of our GP practices. So if we just look at what can we do over and above statins, I think Derek and Kosh have talked about this. Ezetimibe monotherapy, frankly, I rarely find it works. Adding ezetimibe to a statin, around 23% reduction in LDL, which is excellent, and I think we should be doing that in ACS patients. And we've talked about the PCSK9 inhibitors. If we come back to NICE, NICE is saying don't offer us monotherapy, things like fibrates routinely. They have a place in hypertriglyceridemia, which is often neglected. These other agents, such as nicotinic acid, bile sequestrants, omega-3 fatty acids, although we have got some new evidence for icosapent recently. So we are advised to use ezetimibe, and we've now got bempedoic acid and inclisiran. So NICE guidelines recommend intensive reduction of non-HDL cholesterol for primary prevention. We start with an atorvastatin 20 milligrams in those with a 10% risk or above, and aim for a 40% reduction in non-HDL cholesterol. My very personal opinion is that I think that was a mistake. Very few GPs actually set targets of non-HDL cholesterol. It's very difficult to monitor a 40% reduction or set a target for it. So I hope that at some point we'll go back to LDL. So if a person's not able to tolerate a high intensity statin, aim to treat with the maximum tolerated dose, but still look at the targets. If that's not tolerated, choose another statin. You may resort to a lower intensity statin, but I use rosuvastatin 5, sometimes starting it just twice a week, then alternate days and gradually building up, and many patients tolerate that. For those at high risk of cardiovascular disease, intolerant of statins, we should seek advice from specialists, but we've now got bempedoic acid and inclisiran to aim for. Patients with primary heterozygous FH should be considered for ezetimibe treatment on top of their statin, and we've got the PCSK9 inhibitors. I would point all of you to the excellent NHS Accelerated Access Collaborative guidelines, this looks complicated on the right-hand side, but they are actually very good. And I would suggest you all look at these. They also have a statin intolerance pathway. So this is the secondary prevention bit. If a maximum tolerated dose of statin does not achieve that 40% baseline or a non-HDL of 2.5, consider adding ezetimibe, checking the results again in at least 3 months. If recommended statin treatment is contraindicated or not tolerated, follow the statin intolerance algorithm, which I'll show you in a minute. We can add ezetimibe. We can now use ezetimibe with bempedoic acid, which is very well tolerated, rarely causes any muscular side effects because it has very little expression in muscle. If statin therapy is contraindicated, as I've already said, consider ezetimibe first, but frankly, it doesn't work. Go to ezetimibe and bempedoic acid, then inclisiran or PCSK9. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about inclisiran in a moment. So, and the statin intolerance pathway is here. I would urge all of you, we don't really have time to go into it in detail, but have a look at it. It looks complex, but it's not. And it can really guide you through the complexities of statin intolerance, which, in my opinion, is overestimated, and a lot to do with the blooming Daily Mail and the Daily Express, which we should tell our patients to stop reading. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about inclisiran. I think it's a fantastic new addition. Kosh has told you about the evidence behind it. How can we use it? Well, we are able to use it for secondary prevention, where LDL cholesterol is persistently 2.6 millimoles or more, despite maximum tolerated lipid lowering therapy, or when statins are not tolerated or contraindicated. We give the initial injection, another injection at 90 days, 3 months, and then 6 monthly. So it is a drug I've started using in my practice. We have really good searches where we can identify the patients who would benefit from this using either the UCL Partners, University College London Partners searches, or we have a local CDRC search. So we identify those using various searches, and we can then invite them by letter, or many of them I actually phoned to talk through why they're not achieving target. Is it to do with not taking statins, etc.? So we can then encourage those patients to contact us. We can order in inclisiran now through a company called AAH, which virtually every GP practice uses. We order things like B12 injections or prostate cancer therapies, and it's very easy to do. We order it in, and then that costs £45. We can claim back £55 from the Prescription Pricing Authority. So I'm just going to tell you about a couple of patients. So this gentleman, 70-year-old male, angina and hypertension. You can see he's already on the atorvastatin ezetimibe. His LDL cholesterol is 3.1, total cholesterol 5. So I contacted him. He was very happy to have inclisiran. We booked him in a few days later, gave him his first injection. We booked bloods at 11 weeks. And you can see his LDL came down from 3.1 to 0.7, a 73% reduction. And his total cholesterol down to 3.1, a 38% reduction, which is phenomenal. And he is absolutely delighted with it. I've already had a bottle of Macallan from him, which I'll declare to the taxman, of course. My second patient, a female patient who basically couldn't tolerate anything. We tried everything: simvastatin, atorvastatin, rosuvastatin, even ezetimibe, which she said caused muscle pains. So she actually heard about this drug and contacted me. And when she came to have her bloods done, LDL 2.8, total cholesterol 5, we gave her the injections, and you can see that she had a more modest reduction, but nevertheless got her down to around where we would want her. Ideally, we want to push that further. So I am going to discuss with her whether she would take bempedoic acid. I did offer it, but she was very resistant. So primary care, just to finish off very quickly, Derek, the last few slides. Primary care, PCN direct enhanced service, we're asked to treat people with cardiovascular risk, Q risk, 20% or above, with statins, and try and get them down to targets. We're also searching our systems to look for patients with potential FH, those under 29 with a total cholesterol of 7 or more, 30 or over total cholesterol of 9, and we've got targets to achieve. We're doing very well in terms of using lipid-lowering therapies, but this doesn't look at targets and whether we're achieving them. Across my PCN, we're well above the 48%. But if you look to the right, we've got a lot of work to do to detect patients with FH. How are we going to manage these 900 plus patients? Referring them to lipid clinics is going to inundate them. So I'm not going to go through this in great detail, Derek, but what we do need is we need action plans. We need CVD leads. We need strategies. We need to make every contact count. We need to utilize other people like clinical pharmacists, pharmacy technicians, and we need to have these strategies across PCNs. In terms of lipids, we also need to look at BAME groups, deprived groups, health inequalities targets we have, look at things like switching patients to high-intensity statins, and I'm about to start the first sort of PCN service using GenEncode genetic testing in the community. So I'm just going to leave it there because we've not got much time. And thank you very much. So hopefully we'll have some time for questions. But if any GPs out there want to contact me about the PCN CVD plans and lipids in particular, please email me at ahmed@nhs.net or contact us at the PCCS. Thank you.
Thanks, Ahmed. That was absolutely fantastic as well. They were two brilliant talks. And we've had a couple of questions. You can still ask questions in the chat, but the two questions are somewhat pertinent. The first one is for the patient that's just above 2.6 and they're on a modest amount of a high potency statin. Do you double the statin dose, Kosh, or do you add ezetimibe, or do you use that as an opportunity to get the patient on inclisiran and get them down that more than 50% LDL cholesterol, which is significantly more than the other additional therapies? I know what I do. What do you do, Kosh?
Well, let's say that patient has an LDL of 2.7. So if I double the dose of the statin, it's going to come down to about 2.6. If I add an ezetimibe, it's going to be 2.1. The 0.6 millimole lowering of LDL over 5 years is 11% relative risk reduction. If I add an inclisiran, NICE don't really care. They would like you to have tried maximum tolerated statins. You don't even have to add an ezetimibe before. But actually being able to get a patient from 2.7 to 1.35, it's going to give you a 30% relative risk reduction. So, you know, when the government is giving this away at these prices and no country in the world has this, we'd be stupid not to implement it for anybody that is eligible.
So in the UK, it's available for around £100 per year, which I think is really amazing. So going to this, a lot of the patients don't take the statins, whatever we say. And Ahmed, you've mentioned the Daily Mail, and you know I have discussions with the Daily Mail, as Kosh, on a regular basis. but we know that the patients won't take the statins or won't take a high dose of the statins. How are you finding? There's about 1,500 patients in the UK now with inclisiran. I know we've got a significant percentage. How are you finding the patients are finding it, and what's the compliance like? Because clearly you know what the compliance is like because they come into the surgery for the injections.
Yeah. So are we talking about compliance with statins or the?
No. We know the compliance with statins is variable. You said that in your lecture, but I'm now getting a feel for what inclisiran compliance is, and it's very good indeed. I would say even better than the monoclonal antibodies because I know they're getting it because we're giving it to them. Where the monoclonal antibodies, it sits in their fridge at home. Inclisiran does not need to be refrigerated. What do you think compliance is looking like?
Well, I mean, it's obviously very early days, so we've not got many patients on it. But what we're very good in primary care at setting up reminders for patients. So, you know, we have it set up in our systems that we get a task to say this patient is due their inclisiran again. We can then contact them, order it in, and give it. And I think when you've actually shown them the figures of what you've achieved, especially with the first jab, you know, that is going to aid their compliance. I think patients knowing their numbers, understanding the risk, understanding what's happening to their bodies in terms of LDL, non-HDL, it's going to aid compliance. So I can't see that there will be an issue with inclisiran compliance, the way that we're set up in primary care.
So, Gosh, you're clearly the world expert with the studies. What are you thinking? In the studies, of course, people are different, and they show up, but compliance doesn't seem to be an issue.
No, so I've got a whole bunch of patients. So, you know, when you get to the 6 monthly, it's like, oh, it's been 6 months, and I've got calendars and etc. set up, and like, no, actually, it's next month you do. It's approximately 6 months, and it's now month 5. It's all set up. Don't worry about it. So we are seeing that it's actually fine. And it's interesting. I mean, I can give you a couple of scenarios where, you know, the patients are actually that have been on them, they're really well engaged. And, you know, it's early days. Maybe that's why they're so well engaged. But the reminders work very well. You know, it's just a calendar invite and you've got it, the reminders, you get the drug in, patients show up. And the beauty of this is it actually doesn't matter if they're away on holiday and they are going to come back in a month's time. Because we're in Ibiza, it's only going to change by 2 to 4%, maximum 6% between those 2 months. So, you know, don't worry about it. You're on mute.
Derek.
Very relevant. I've got lots of my patients that go off like snowbirds to places like the Punjab for the winter, and they come back. And so I've already been asked by a patient, what happens if I don't have it to 9 months? Now, we've got the pharmacokinetic data. It doesn't disappear. It goes down a bit, but it's still working, Kosh. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's still working. And what people basically will say is, I'm not sure you necessarily need to dose up again. But if you've missed your window by more than 3 months, the idea is that you would effectively start with that 3 month window again. So you'd give the 9 month. 3 months later. So the idea is that you're maintaining consistent reductions of 50%. But in essence, quite frankly, I've got plenty of patients where they've gone out a bit further, and you just give it, and it'll basically they will get back towards their starting level.
Yeah, and the last one, clearly the ORION 4 study is ongoing, but all of the evidence from the monoclonal antibody studies that you and I did are that blockade of PCSK9 is safe, and it's all about LDL cholesterol reduction. So far, everything is pointing in the right direction. Do you think we'll get any surprises, Kosh, in ORION 4?
I think we'll probably be surprised that we do better than we think, and I'll tell you why I say that. One, we've learned from both of the monoclonal studies, it's in the rush to get these drugs out and to be first, they were short. In the first year after starting any lipid lowering agent, we talked about, and the correct answer was 22%, you get half that benefit, whether it's a MAB or a statin, you get 11% relative benefit in year 1. Because you're trying to change something that's been around for 60 or 70 years, and you can't expect miracles in a year. So The longer you go, the bigger the benefits. So with all of these studies now, they are going to have, ORION 4 will have a median follow-up of 4 years, which means year 2, year 3, year 4, you look at CTT, you get more relative benefit. The second beautiful thing about this is all of the people in the placebo arm who are on statins in the background, we are not going to see as much the effect of non-adherence in the background as you are in the comparator group, which means effectively think about banks and you use smoking. I'll say put money away into a bank account. If you get cumulative interest, the longer you have it there, the greater the benefit. So what we could end up seeing is greater benefits than we saw with the MAB trials because of cumulative exposure being sustained. I mean, you know, even somebody misses there. If this was a small molecule trial, we absolutely panic when people come off medications. Once they're injected, I've got about a year before, you know, they're still exposed to a lower cholesterol. So as long as I know what's happened to the patient, actually, this is just incredible, this approach.
Yep, I think you've hit the nail on the head, and we're coming up to our magical hour. I'm going to thank every one of you for attending out there, your attendees. We've had people as far away as Mongolia, which is incredibly pleasing. And I'm particularly going to thank our organizers behind the scenes, but obviously Kosh and Ahmed, who have been truly fantastic. I hope you've learned a lot. I have, and clearly the new landscape of lipid lowering is incredibly important. And remember, and this is one statistic I want you to remember, we think about 7% of all deaths in the UK are due to high cholesterol. So we now have the therapies to treat it. Please go out there and do it. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. Let's do the next talk in Mongolia live.
Yes.
For everybody that joined the polls, all of the results will be published. If any of the questions haven't been answered, the transcript will indeed be sent to the three of you. I'd like to thank you all. And also, I have had the okay from both Kosh and Derek. Ahmed, are you okay with your slides being shared?
Absolutely.
Because the audience, brilliant. The audience reached about 146, but there were, 350 odd registrants because a lot will be doctors and watching it later. So all the slides will be available in the file tray.
Thank you very much indeed, everyone. Again, have a great day.
Let's see some patients now.
Yeah, exactly. Bye.